Good afternoon. This is Daniel here with Cop Watch TV. I just wanted to welcome everyone into this week's episode. So what we're going to do, just like every week, is go over just the most important and the most interesting news and issues when it comes to policing. And we're going to take those issues and we're basically going to break down the most interesting issues in policing. So we do this every single week. And every week we do this, I think there are just so many cases to choose from. And last week we had a whole bunch of great cases. And this week too, just such really just interesting and complex cases that we're going to break down here today for you. But while we're doing that, it's good to interact. So I want everyone to, if you have questions or comments, or if you think that I'm saying something that is a right track, wrong track, definitely put it in the comments. I definitely try to address those as we're going through it, because I think it's important to not only see what I think about these cases, but to also look, maybe someone has a different point of view and seeing what they have to say about these cases as well. So if you do a super chat, that will guarantee that we read it on air. However, definitely put comments in. And if there are other cases that we haven't covered that you think are interesting or you have questions about, definitely put that in the chat as well. I just want to remind everyone, if you haven't already, please make sure that you subscribe to the Cop Watch TV channel. That way, when we do this, every single Friday, you'll know when we're coming on, and so you can be a part of it. And also, we do great videos throughout the week of raw, unedited body cam footage that we put out as well, just to really capture the interaction, the raw interaction between police officers and citizens. So with that, if you want to follow me, I am on YouTube and TikTok at Police Law News, where I do daily content over there. But otherwise, let's get into the cases this week. And, before we get into the cases this week, and there's going to be kind of a theme. Well, there's always a theme. When most of these cases are around use of force from police officers. And, it's really easy to say this is a case where this is justified force, it's legal force. But, what does that mean? Because, we all know that there's a group of people that no matter what happens, no matter what the police situation is, where it's like a reflex, where they automatically support the police and think the police did nothing wrong. And that isn't the right way to look at these cases. And there's also another group, a smaller but louder group, where no matter what the police officer does, again, it's like a reflex where they're against the police, where the police is wrong, the police officer is racist, they went to work that morning wanting to violate someone's rights. I think most of us know that the truth lies somewhere in the middle. So there's an alt-middle position that kind of looks at the situation for what it is, applies the law and the facts, and then asks tough questions to figure out whether or not something is reasonable or lawful. But it's also important to ask, well, what do we mean when we say lawful? So I'm not going to give a law school class here or anything like that, but really what we talk about, and this is going to come up in a lot of these cases today, that it's objective reasonableness from the police officer. This comes from a case that was from Graham versus Connor that the Supreme Court decided in 1989. And really the most important thing about this is that before that, if you wanted to claim that there was an excessive force from a police officer, the standard was malicious intent. So if someone had their rights violated by a police officer, especially when it came to use of force, you would have to show that the police officer had malicious intent. So essentially you had to get into the mind of the police officer in order to figure out why they were doing something. And there's a lot of people who think police officers don't have very high IQs, so that's difficult to do in the first place. But, in this malicious intent, it was just almost an impossible standard. You would basically have to show that the police officer only used this excessive force because they wanted to, because they just felt like it. And, it was derived from the Due Process Clause in the 14th Amendment, and then cruel and unusual punishment in the 8th Amendment. It was really difficult. So what Graham versus Connor did, kind of where this is going to, what Graham versus Connor did, it basically said that is too high of a standard. So we're going to take it down to the 4th Amendment, the reasonableness standard. So was the use of force reasonable by a police officer? And that's kind of what we're going with. And you say, well, what's reasonable? That could be different to different people. The Supreme Court says, hang on, I got you. Here's a couple different factors that we want you to look at. And, this isn't an exhaustive list, but here are some of the things that we're going to consider when we're making a determination about whether or not the actions of the police are reasonable. So the first one is the severity of the crime. This is what we're going to look at. So obviously, a police officer might use different levels of force if someone had just committed an armed robbery or a murder as opposed to littering. The next one is the immediacy of the threat. So when we talked about immediacy of the threat, obviously it might be different level of force that a police officer might use. If someone has a knife and they're just about to plunge it into grandma, that's pretty immediate. The officer has to do something, as opposed to someone who jaywalked and they're walking away and they're not a threat to anyone. And the last one is the level of resistance. So how much fight does the person have when the police are trying to apprehend them or get them into custody? The more of a resistance, maybe someone is trying to disarm a police officer, like take their taser. Or maybe you have someone who just isn't actively resisting, but they're just laying on the ground like dead weight. Well, we would expect a police officer to use different levels of force. So when we talk about like these objective standards, these are kind of the baseline that we're going to go with. And that takes us into the first case, which is, this is the case that everyone is talking about. And if you're interested in these issues and follow, police and news, this is the case that you should be talking about and should be on your mind, because it is an important case. And the body cam actually just came out sometime in the last 24 to 48 hours. This case happened this week. It was in Columbus, Ohio, with Columbus police, and the individual who was killed by police officers, his name was Donovan Lewis, and he was 20 years old. All right, here's what happened. So there was a warrant that police officers were serving. Again, this is in Columbus, Ohio, and this is Donovan Lewis. And we're also going to put a link to the body cam video on there as well, so you can go back later and watch it and let us know what you think. In the chat, there's a link, though. So Donovan Lewis had a warrant. He lived in an apartment complex. And the warrants, it wasn't one of these, Breonna Taylor warrants where, where the person was, ancillary kind of connected to a drug ring, or they rented a car that had dead bodies in it later or something like that. No, the warrant was because his girlfriend had filed a complaint with police officers that he battered her. So he essentially had a warrant for domestic violence, assault, and then also for improper handling of a weapon. Now, this kid was only 20 years old, but he also had a criminal history for battering another girlfriend. He also had domestic violence charges where he was alleged to have battered his mother. But for this case, he only had the warrants for the domestic violence case. And what police did is they didn't do a no-knock warrant. Again, this isn't like Breonna Taylor or any of these other cases where it was kind of a no-knock warrant. That's not the case. So this did happen at night, but police officers did knock at the apartment. It's all on body cam video. Again, one of the reasons why body cams are so important for police officers. The police officers knocked on the door and they announced who they were for over 8 minutes. Eventually, 2 individuals did open the door and they came out. Police officers placed them in handcuffs just to secure them while they searched the rest of the residence. Now, as the individuals came out, 2 young men, police officers asked them a couple questions that you would expect police officers to ask in a situation like this. Is there anybody else in the house? And is one of those people Donovan Lewis? That's who we're here for. So the 2 individuals refused to tell police officers. So they refused to tell police officers if there was anyone in the house, and then specifically if Donovan Lewis was there. They said they didn't know. Now, maybe they didn't. Maybe they had been sleeping for the last 12 hours and they honestly didn't know. But the police officer said something to the effect of, well, you don't know who's in your house? Like, you don't know who's in your apartment? That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Anyways, and you have to think about it this way. Now, maybe these 2 individuals thought that Donovan was in the house. Now, maybe they thought that they were doing him some kind of favor, but I promise you that isn't a favor. The reason it isn't a favor, because you have to look at it this way. If the police officers are going into a residence and they're walking around and they're searching for someone, if they don't know where someone is, but at any point someone could pop out. Someone could make their presence known, someone could attack them, or someone could shoot them. The best way to think about that is like you're walking through a haunted house, okay? Imagine walking through a haunted house and you're not sure where someone might pop out at. So that's kind of like being a police officer when you're searching the residence. You never know what's going to happen. So you can imagine a situation where someone in that particular incident could be more on edge, right? And that's not what you want from police officers. And yes, they train for this, but that's the mindset. Whereas think about it the other way. What if the individuals had said, yes, hey, there's one more person in the house. It's Donovan. He's actually in the bedroom across from the kitchen. He's alone. Don't think he has any weapons. So, well, then the police officers, yes, they're still going to be, their head is going to be on a swivel, but they're going to be a little more secure knowing, okay, if we open this door across from the kitchen, like we probably know that Donovan's going to be in there. So any, element of surprise might be taken away. And that's going to play a factor in here. So after they get him after they clear the 2 other individuals out, they go and they have a canine. They have a dog. They have a dog run through that helps them search this apartment. Well, the dog hones in on a closed door that's pretty much right off of the kitchen. And, the dog is sniffing and indicating on that door. So they know that there's someone there. So what the officers do is they approach, and the canine officer, he's doing whatever canine stuff he's doing with his left hand, or he has the leash, but he has his handgun in his right hand. He opens the door, and pretty much as soon as he opens the door, Donovan Lewis, who was sleeping, wakes up, sits up, turns around, and faces the officer. Simultaneously, as he's in that motion, in that process of sitting up, the police officer, the canine officer, fires 1 shot. Hits Donovan in the abdomen. He died of his injuries. He was 20 years old. He was not armed. He didn't have a weapon. He didn't have a gun. So what in the world happened? Watching the video, all we have right now is to watch the body cam video. We have the news reports from the local news stations, the stories about it, and some statements, from the family and the family attorney. So that's all we have to go on right now. And obviously, as more information comes out, it would be reasonable to have a different opinion about it. But here's what I think happened. I think this was a negligent discharge of a firearm by the police officer. And I can back that up. Here's my evidence for that. So let's think about that. So pretty much as the door opens, immediately Mr. Lewis sits up, and there's a shot fired almost immediately. Now, what some people are saying is that as Donovan sat up, he kind of moved his arm like this towards the police officer, and he had something in his hand. Some people are saying that it was a vape pen in his hand. I don't know if he had a vape pen in his hand or not, but what I am saying is that I always talk about, there's a reaction gap from police officers, from any humans. Once you see a threat, the human body takes a certain amount of time to recognize that threat, react, and respond. So what I'm saying is if you watch the video, and I've watched it in slow motion, and I think it's even in slow motion, there's a portion of it on the video that we put in the chats, but if you look at it, to say that the officer recognized the vape pen, processed it, and then fired a shot because of that, that would be almost humanly impossible. All of the research from force science and from human performance that I talk about all the time, that I know is good science, it just doesn't make sense. So I don't think the officer perceived a deadly threat. So that's one of the reasons. Also, at no point did not that officers have to, and sometimes police, it's not feasible to do so, but the officer didn't yell out any commands prior to shooting. He didn't yell to Mr. Lewis about to drop anything, and he didn't alert any of the other police officers that there was some kind of an immediate deadly threat in that room. Now, again, it's not always feasible for police officers to do that, but this is going to go in that bucket of evidence of why I think this was a negligent discharge of a firearm. Also, as soon as the officer fires the weapon, he immediately yells, "Oh," and he acts surprised. That's what it seems like to me. He yells, "Oh," and he seems surprised. And then he immediately holsters his weapon. Now, let's go to that really quick. So how many officer-involved shootings do we see? Right after an officer shoots someone, do they ever holster their weapon? No. And here's why. If you honestly believe that there is an immediate deadly threat behind that doorway, you fire 1 time, you don't have a visual of the person, and then you're going to holster your weapon, and then you're going to stand pretty much in the door frame for another 90 seconds. That doesn't make sense. So he wasn't acting like a person who had just been faced with an immediate deadly threat, reacted, and now we're not sure what's happening, because Donovan was still, at this point, he was still alive. He was still making noises. So, if you honestly thought that there was an immediate deadly threat, it doesn't, these actions from the officer don't make sense. Now, I should say that when a human is involved in stressful situations like this, a lot of times their actions don't make sense. But this guy had been a cop for 30 years. He's had training. He's had a good history for 30 years. He's had a lot of training. So everything he did would not be in line with training, any police training, when you're faced with an immediate deadly threat. So those are the reasons why I think that this was a negligent discharge. So, I think in one of the videos I did about this yesterday when it first came out, I called it an accidental discharge. I called it an AD. Well, someone commented on my TikTok that, hey, it's actually an ND. And so I did some research on that, because sometimes I get things wrong, and I like to be corrected, because I think it's important to be accurate. So when I was trained, what I remember back in 2005 when I went through a police academy, that, all of this stuff in this umbrella was called an AD, an accidental discharge. Well, apparently at some point along the way it changed. So now the way you have to look at it, or the way that it's if you read any blogs or articles now, the way it's classified now, and maybe it was classified this the whole time and I just wasn't paying attention, but the way it's classified now, if there's a malfunction, so if there's a malfunction with the gun that has nothing to do with the person holding the gun, think Alex Baldwin if he was telling the truth, okay? So that would be an AD, an accidental discharge, and nothing to do with the person holding the gun. It just goes off. It's the magic gun theory, okay? That's an accidental discharge. A negligent discharge is if the operator of the gun, who's ever holding it, violates any of the basic firearm rules of safety. That would be a negligent discharge. So I would say this is likely a negligent discharge. Now, here's what I think happened, and let me know if you think this is reasonable or not. Here's what I think happened. So the officer, he was the canine officer. He had a one-handed grip on the gun. So pretty much as he enters the room, or as he opens the door, the gun comes up, which might be reasonable if you're going to try to, clear a room, especially if you think someone's in there. The gun comes up. Almost as soon as the gun comes up, it fires once. So and it was a one-handed grip, it wasn't a two-handed grip. So what I think likely happened is that he violated one of the he violated one of the basic rules of firearm safety, which is you do not put your finger on the trigger until you are ready to fire the weapon. So what I think happened, and I don't have any way to verify this right now, but what it seems like the most reasonable thing is, as the officer came up, he had his finger on the trigger, which was a violation of the firearm safety rules, and then he was either momentarily distracted, maybe by the dog, or he was surprised by that someone was in the room, or maybe he was trying to do something with his left hand, like pull the leash or do anything with his left hand, but there was a sympathetic reflex where the right finger also did the same thing. Or maybe because he only had a one-handed grip, he was trying to slightly readjust the grip that he had on the gun, but because his finger was on the trigger, it went off. So that's what it seems like to me, is that it was a negligent discharge. Now, I haven't seen anybody else say that or make that claim or say this is what they think happened. This is what I think is the most reasonable explanation for what happened. Now I think, well, okay, if that's the case, if I'm right, then what does that mean? Well, we have to think about it this way. So let's play a game. Let's assume that I'm right about this, and this is factually what happened. It's all going to come out, but let's say what I'm saying is correct. Let's walk down this legal path. Really, what that would be is, so he didn't have any intent to hurt or kill Mr. Lewis. There's no intent there, but he was negligent, and his negligence caused the death of another human. So that would be whatever the Ohio equivalent of negligent homicide would be. The best way to think about that is, the closest case, think about Kim Potter. So this is like the Kim Potter case, meaning obviously there was no taser confusion, but she wasn't intending to kill someone. She wasn't intending to kill Dante Wright, but she was negligent, and her negligence caused the death. That essentially, base bones, negligent homicide. So that's what this looks like to me. Saying that the police officer, he had on 30 years. As far as I can tell, or as far as anyone has reported, he's had a good history for 30 years. So on the video that I posted about this earlier on one of my other pages, people were saying the typical things that dishonest people say, like, oh, he was a racist cop. He was just looking to hurt someone, looking to shoot someone. So let's just break that down a little bit of how ridiculous this is. So here's what you're saying if you say that. You're going to say that if someone is going to spend 30 years as a career as a police officer, when they could retire at 20 or 25 years. So they've been a police officer for 30 years. They have an excellent, stellar record, no other bad use of force or unlawful shootings. And then one day, when they're in their 50s and they're close to retirement, being able to enjoy the rest of their life with a pretty decent pension, they're going to murder someone illegally for no reason on camera, so they could spend a couple years in jail or a long time in jail and lose their pension. So, I mean, if that's what you think that the officer woke up in the morning and said he was going to do, I'm going to call bullshit on that, because that's absolutely nuts. So, not saying the officer shouldn't be punished. He took someone's life. I think that it was negligence that caused that, and negligent homicide is probably the most reasonable explanation for what happened, but I like to hear other points of view. So this is a case that we are absolutely going to follow, and we'll see what happens. So let's see if we have any comments from people. Let's see. We have some people saying that they should use a robot to do these kinds of things. Okay, let's see. Cop Block Hot Springs. Oh, is that Hot Springs, Arkansas, or Hot Springs, South Dakota. Let me know. How would the cop have handled the situation without a dog or a gun? Was that considered? No, it's not considered, and it wouldn't. That's a really good question. Thank you for asking that. No, it's not considered, and it wouldn't be considered. So police officers have guns because this is a really dangerous country. No one would do this job if police officers weren't armed. Also, this is someone who had a felony warrant. He wasn't cooperative with police because he didn't just come right to the door, and one of the charges against him was a weapon charge and proper handling of firearm. So here you have, from the reason, just the police officer point of view, or for any reasonable person point of view, you have someone with felony warrants who has a violent history, who's not cooperative with police, and one of the recent charges that he has a warrant for involves a weapon. No, that's absolutely a situation. No police officer would go into that situation without a gun. That wouldn't make any sense. That is not something that would ever happen in our country. So that's the answer to that. Let's see. Ego 10, shoot first, ask questions later is the method police subscribe to. Well, I don't think so. So let's break down this comment. Let's give it a little bit of credence here. That's the method police officers subscribe to. So let's take this off. This officer was a cop for 30 years. He probably took thousands of calls for service in 30 years, and he made a mistake one time. So if that's what you're saying, is that, one mistake after a 30-year career means that his whole mindset is to shoot first. Again, I'm going to call bullshit on that. Mickey Lineham, was it really an accident, though? Well, Mickey, I don't know. I don't know if it was an accident, and I can't get into the police officer's head. I'm looking objectively at the evidence to see what happened. I gave my reasons why, to me, this looks so I don't believe that Mr. Lewis posed a deadly threat. And I don't think that after the shooting, the officer did not act like an officer who was concerned about a deadly threat. To me, he was acting like someone who just made just a horrible mistake, a horrible accident. That's what it seems like to me. So no, there's no way to know for sure, but that's my opinion of what happened. I'm basing it. I gave you my reasons, my evidence of why I think that. Could that be the case? I don't have any idea. Let's see. Bad cops show up early, good cops show up late. Okay, so they knocked on the door for 8 minutes before they went in, and then they gave a whole bunch of warnings, so I would consider that being late. Let's see. When you pass laws banning high IQ officers and laws stating police have no constitutional duty, Todd Higgins. Okay, Todd, so I'm going to address that really quick because this is something that comes. So there's a lot of, I call it myths. There's a lot of myths when it comes to police officers, and this is one of them. So I'm going to educate you a little here a bit, Todd Higgins. So Todd said something about police officers, there being a law. He said a law to prohibit, people with high IQs from being a police officer. He's going back to a case from 2000. I believe it was in Connecticut. Can't remember the name of it, but I remember the facts. So this was a case of an individual. There's a small town in Connecticut, it might be Newport, can't remember, but it was a town in Connecticut where someone applied to be a police officer. Now, as part of this hiring process for this one small town, they do an IQ test. And this individual scored really high on an IQ test. And this one police department said, we don't want to hire this person because of their high IQ. Not because we don't think that people with high IQs can't do a great job as a police officer. What they said is that we think that someone with a high IQ might get bored as a police officer in this small town. It was a small town. It wasn't like New York City or LAPD or anything like that. But they said, we think they might get bored and then they would leave our department. Well, we don't want to put in $100,000 worth of training for someone who's just going to leave us in 6 months or a year. That's not a good financial decision for the city. So they didn't hire him for that reason. He sued. Once he sued, it went up to court. It went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And basically the Supreme Court said a couple things. They agreed with the city, first of all, but here's why they agreed with the city. They agreed with the city because they said, well, in order to make it, so he was basically making a discrimination claim. He was saying the city didn't hire me, they discriminated against me because I have a high IQ. Now, when it comes to the law, in order to make a claim of discrimination, you have to be part of a group of people that, for lack of a better term, is able to be discriminated against. I have on a gray shirt right now, okay? So I can't claim that someone discriminated against me because I have on a gray shirt. I have a lot of gray hair too. I can't say, hey, they discriminated against me because I have gray hair. So gray-haired people isn't a category of people that has the ability to claim discrimination. You have to be part of a protected class. Does that make sense? So what the Supreme Court said is they said, well, a high IQ just isn't a protected class. And if you're not in a protected class, a protected group, you can't make a claim against discrimination. So basically they said, for like legal, So on a technicality, they basically sided with the city and dismissed the lawsuit. But in their findings, they said, hey, the Supreme Court said, hey, we don't think this is wise for cities to do this. That was basically how it is. Then the individual went to work as a corrections officer for like 20 years. He never got bored and he kept working there. So I guess my point is, this was one department who had an employment issue with one person. It wasn't a law. So I'm just trying to educate you there, Todd. You said it was a law against banning police officers with IQs. I've had this question probably about 10 times, or this comment 10 times in the last couple weeks. So I just wanted to put all of the facts out there. And if you don't believe me, go ahead and look it up for yourself. This was not a law. It was one case, and I explained the facts and circumstances around it. Okay, let's see. Okay. I'm not seeing any other comments about that particular case, but, I'm really interested to see what people think about the theory that I have of this case. So put any comments in there, and definitely go and watch the video. So the video that we put up there also has it in slow motion a couple times, so you can really see and why I think this is what happened. Let's see. So the next case that I want to talk about is Richard Richards. We're also going to put a video to this. Let's see. We're also going to put up a video to the Richard Richards shooting. So this happened a while ago, so last November. I don't know if you remember this case. So the basic facts of this case are, it was in Tucson, Arizona in November of 2021, and Mr. Richards, he's in a wheelchair. He's in his 60s. I think he's 61 years old, and he lived with his sister. And him and his sister got into a fight. He asked her to drop him off at kind of like a business park. There's like a Lowe's, there's a Home Depot. There's, we all know these business parks in these metro areas. So he basically asked her to drop him off in this business park. So he is wheeling around in his wheelchair, and he goes into a store. I think it was Walmart. I'm pretty sure it was a Walmart, and he steals a toolbox. Okay, he takes a toolbox, and as he's trying to leave with the toolbox, he has a knife. When one of the individuals at the front of it's a greeter or a checker or clerk, when someone tells him, hey, listen, you got to pay for that, he pulls out the knife on the individual and threatens them. Now, it's a different level. Now, a knife is a deadly weapon, 100%. I say that every single week. But it's a different level of threat if someone is in a wheelchair than if someone is not in a wheelchair and they're running around with a knife. So I mean, just common sense says that's a different level of threat. But he did threaten someone with a knife as he was trying to leave with a shoplifted material. Police were called, and this officer, Ryan Remington, I think he was working an overtime shift kind of at the business park, either at the Lowe's or one of those stores. So, he was aware of what happened, that, an individual was in a wheelchair, pulled a knife on a clerk after he stole something. So Mr. Richards, he wheels himself across the parking lot, and he's about to enter another store. That is where Mr. Richards and the Officer Remington meet, pretty much in the parking lot, almost at the entrance to the next store. I think it was a Lowe's, not 100% sure, but it's a store. So the officer runs up to Mr. Richards pretty much as he's just about to enter the store. So he's just about to wheel himself in, and he encounters him. He yells at him to not go in the store. Mr. Richards says something to the effect of like, well, you're going to have to shoot me, or he says something to that effect. So, well, that's exactly what Officer Remington does. Mr. Richards is just about to enter the store, like literally just about to enter the threshold of the store. The officer is behind him, and he shoots Mr. Richards from the back 9 times, kills him. The reason that the officer gave for this officer-involved shooting is he said that he thought and he was afraid that Mr. Richards posed a deadly threat to employees inside the store. He said Mr. Richards had a knife. He already threatened someone with that knife. I don't want him to go into another store because he could hurt, stab, or kill someone else. I was concerned about that. So that was the reason he gave for the officer-involved shooting. And the video, the body cam video, and the surveillance video from the store came out almost immediately. And I remember I covered this when it first came out, and almost immediately I said, this does not look like a lawful shooting. This does not look like a justified shooting. Because we have to look at those things, the severity of the crime, immediacy of the threat, and the level of resistance. So, we have a severe crime. I got it. Okay. Level of resistance, well, he's actively resisting. He's not attacking the officer, but he is running away. Here's the problem, the immediacy of the threat. So if someone is in a wheelchair, what risk do they pose with someone with a knife? That's a reasonable question to ask, and that's the problem in this case, is that it wasn't a reasonable use of force. So the officer was fired, and he was actually just indicted this past week on manslaughter charges. So we have to think, okay, well, what should the officer have done? So the officer's attorney has actually done a bunch of different interviews on this, and, they asked him reasonable questions that you should ask. Well, why didn't he use a taser? Why didn't he do these other things? So what the attorney said is, well, the officer didn't use a taser, well, one, because he was behind Mr. Richards, and because it was narrow, so you can't tase someone in a wheelchair from behind, because if the taser hits, the probes hit anything, they're going to hit the wheelchair, not the individual, so it's not going to have any effect. And he said, the officer really didn't want to run around in front of Mr. Richards because he had a knife. He didn't want to get stabbed as he's running around him. He didn't want to get close to him. Well, that's kind of reasonable too. So I get why the officer didn't utilize a taser in this situation. That doesn't make the shooting justified, but it's reasonable why a taser wasn't used. So now we have to think, okay, you have someone who's armed with a knife, they're in a wheelchair, and they're entering a store. What options do we have as a police officer? So to me, it seems, yeah, you don't want to get close. You don't want to, because the person has a knife, you can't risk getting stabbed as an officer or as anybody. So, some people say, well, they should have tipped the wheelchair over from the back or done that. But listen, if you get within a few feet of this wheelchair, you could absolutely be stabbed and killed. So that's not a reasonable thing to say. But what could you do? You have at least 2 police officers there. The first thing you should do is call for backup. 100% start calling for backup. Get as many people there as possible. And then maybe start yelling at the store clerks, at the people who work there. Everybody needs to clear out. You need to make space. This is a police emergency. Everybody leave out the back of the store. That way, you get everybody out. Unless this is one of these super fast, crazy wheelchairs, this isn't going to be a thing. He's not going to be able to outrun people who are motivated to get out of his way. And with police officers, just with a loud voice, doing that. Now, if he has a knife and he's going in on someone who isn't paying attention, well, that's a different situation, okay? That would be an immediate threat. This wasn't an immediate threat, okay? If anything, it was an imminent threat, which probably doesn't even lead to that. So he was just indicted on that, and I think that is probably the right move. He was fired by the city of Tucson, and I think it is probably correct that he is charged with a crime in this case. This does not look like a justified officer-involved shooting, but I am curious to see what anyone else has to say about this. Bruce Blankenship says overkill. Yeah, I agree. Let's see. Ego 10, shooting anyone in a wheelchair 9 times is crazy. Yeah, Ego 10, I agree. Now, of course, I can think of a situation where it would be justified. Again, if he was just about to stab someone or if he had a gun, that isn't the case here. So again, I think this seems like an unlawful training. Deborah Sandoval, training is mental health awareness, lacks in many agencies. 100%, absolutely, yes. De-escalation, and that's one of the things that I always talk about is like, the people have kind of gotten away from the terrible, horrible slogan and policy of defund the police. That's a good thing. We want them to go away from that. But when they were in the middle of 2020 riots, defund the police, that's one of the things that I was saying is, hey, all of these things that you're saying you want to improve police departments, I agree with. The problem is they all cost more money, not less money. So defunding the police is just going to take more resources, more training, get less qualified police officers. The only thing that will guarantee is that there are more unlawful police killings, which is the goal to avoid, in my opinion. Let's see, North Sac Maniac. They had plenty of time to stop him before he entered the store. They followed him for several minutes. Yes, they did. They did, absolutely. So if you watch the body camera, so there might have been, I know there was a female police officer on scene as well, Mr. Maniac. I know that there was a female police officer on scene, at least from what I could see from the Officer Remington's body camera video. It looks like he exits the car and gets out and kind of runs and jumps out and then, has the confrontation with the individual kind of right there. But is it possible that there was earlier contact with him with a different officer that I'm not aware of? 100%, but at least from that one body cam video that I saw. And I did watch all of the footage when it first came out back in November, but it's been a while. So trying to remember this case and go in there. Let's see. So yeah, no, I think that's those are reasonable. Those are reasonable questions. Bruce Blankenship, shove your ass through the wheels. Yeah, so I like that. I'm kidding. No, so I don't think you should get close enough. Like I said, even though someone's in a wheelchair, they have a knife, you still have to see that as a deadly weapon. You should not get within a few feet of anyone in that situation. But how about OC? Mace? What about that? I mean, could two or three officers stand 9 feet away and drown this guy in mace? Maybe, yes. But yeah, it's I Yeah, and I've thought about this a lot, and one of the things that they should have done, which I think most departments should get trained for, is maybe they should have issued a spike belt or done some kind of a pit maneuver. They should get one of those really big carts from Lowe's and Home Depot, one of those like giant carts that you put like pallets on. They could do a pit maneuver. So if any department needs me to train that, I'm definitely open to that suggestion for sure. Yeah, maybe like a lumber cart to ramming technique video or something. Let's see. How does a cop know he can't jump up? Oh, that is such a great question. Barach Dove. I don't know if I said that right. How does the cop know he can't jump up? So I was going to cover that, but I just didn't. So I'm not ignoring your comment. I was actually going to put that in there. So that's one of the what ifs. Okay, so what if this person in a wheelchair, what if he doesn't need the wheelchair? What if it's like, I know I reference Seinfeld every week, but it's my favorite show. What if there's a George Costanza moment where he's pretending to be a disabled person, and eventually he gets up out of the wheelchair and he can hold it above his head and stuff like that, and then Mr. Kruger catches him. But so that's a real possibility. How do you know if this person actually is disabled, or maybe they just have an ankle injury? All right, maybe they just have an ankle injury and they can still get up and walk away. Fine, but you have to go with what the evidence that you have now. And there was no evidence that he was able to walk. No one saw him walk. No one saw him stand up. Now, since you are an armed police officer and you are right there, the second he stands up with the knife, that absolutely changes the situation. But that didn't happen. Oh, also, here's what I'm going to say too. Let's say there was a shopper or someone who he was moving his wheelchair, bearing down on with the knife. Well, then in that situation, whether he's standing or not, that would be a reasonable deadly force situation. However, there were no employees that were really anywhere near, and he actually shot him before he entered the store because he was afraid of what he might do, not because of what he was doing at the time. And so yeah, I think that's an important question. That's a good question. I thought about that a lot. But like I said, without objective evidence, it's difficult to use deadly force on someone because I think that they might do this when there's no evidence that they have that ability. So I'm sure that's going to be his defense. If I were his defense attorney, that is absolutely one of the things I would try to throw at the wall. And you know what? Maybe that is something that went through the officer's mind because it absolutely should. But you have to react to the situation that you have in front of you. And what you had in front of you was not someone who was standing up. Again, if he did stand up, that's a different situation, and we'd be talking about that situation, but it didn't happen. Source code, when people say defund the police, they don't mean taking away money. It means shifting spending priorities, a bigger percentage of the budget for mental health professionals. So what you just said, source code, that's a reasonable thing to say. But however, that's not what they did. So if you look at it this way, New York City cut $1 billion from the police department budget. So they were taking money away. In the city of Minneapolis, the city councilors actually voted to defund the police by a pretty significant amount. Citizen groups had to sue in court to make it so they couldn't defund the police, because in Minneapolis, there's actually something in the city charter that says you have to have so many police, per so many citizens. So because of the city charter, the city of Minneapolis was not able to defund the police, but they absolutely tried. And the city councilors were saying, we want to defund the police. The same thing happened in Seattle and in Portland. Crime went up in all of these places. You can look it up. I'm not making this up. So many police officers left these cities because, if you're going to be a police officer, who wants to work in this environment? So now, if you want to be a police officer in Seattle, you can lateral over there. They will give you about $30,000 just to sign up to be a police officer in Seattle. So so the way that you describe defund the police, that is what reasonable people say. And backtracking, how much of a disaster defund the police was, this is what people are saying to try to make it seem like, oh no, that's not what we meant. Go back. You look at what AOC, what Bill de Blasio, you look at what these people were saying, and they were saying defund the police. And not in the way that you said it, because the way that you said it is reasonable. We all want more funding for mental health services. No one is against that, okay? And just so you know, police officers aren't against that either. Okay, so I mean, they wouldn't be. If you say, hey, we're going to get these really great mental health professionals, and they're actually going to take over all of these calls for service, these difficult calls with these violent people who might be experiencing homelessness or are living on the streets, you think police officers are like, oh no, we want to do that. We love that job. That isn't the case. That would be like if you worked at a grocery store, and let's say someone comes in, the aisle where there's pickles and pasta sauce. Someone comes in, take a baseball bat, and just smashes it all in it smashes it all, and the entire aisle is an absolute mess. That would be like someone coming and saying, hey, you don't have to do that job. We've got someone else to do it for you. So that'd be like that person saying, oh, no, I need to do this job. So no, police officers absolutely would love for mental health professionals to take over these calls for service. So when police officers are not against that type of funding. So the next case I want to talk about is James Rayal. So James Rayal, and maybe I'm saying it wrong, it's Rayl. I'm going to call it James Rayal. So I think a lot of us have seen this. This happened on July 3rd in Sydney, Ohio. And this was the case. We're going to post a video to it as well. It's actually a Ring doorbell camera video. This was a case where, and it's really interesting. It's an individual, he's 22 years old. He goes to his ex-girlfriend's house. And there's some controversy about why he was there. But he goes to his ex-girlfriend's house, and he starts banging on the door. Then he uses his shoulder, and from the where it looks like on the Ring camera video, it looks like the door's coming down. I mean, it's hard to tell, but that's what it seems like. You can hear people on the other side. You could hear like a younger female yell and scream. You can also hear who sounds like a middle-aged man who ends up being the girl's father. He yells through the door, "I have a gun." So he gives a warning like, "I have a gun. Stop doing this. Stop trying to break into the house." So what happened there is, you can on the Ring camera video, you can kind of hear it sounds like the door is breaking. And at some point, shots are fired, through the door. Don't know how far into the door he actually got, but shots are fired. He's hit 3 different times, and he dies on scene. The father who did the shooting is not charged. Just came out that he is not going to be charged with any crimes. Watching it, to me, that seems reasonable. It seems like, there shouldn't be any charges. I mean, because think of it this way. If someone is breaking into your house, the law doesn't require you to let them come in, interview them, and interview them, and then assess their level of threat. Maybe they just wanted to come in and play Jenga. So there isn't any requirement of that you have to wait when someone is trying to enter your house like that. You can stop them beforehand. It specifically says that in Ohio. So Ohio in 2021 passed a stand your ground law. It was SB 175. And that bill, and you hear about these stand your ground laws, and maybe they sound unreasonable. To me, this doesn't sound unreasonable, but put it in the chat. You let me know what part of this law is unreasonable. So the first part of this law, of the stand your ground law, doesn't mean you can just go out killing people and shooting people anytime you want. That absolutely is not the case. So here's what the law says. And this is pretty much standard language in most stand your ground laws across the country. So pretty much here's what the law says. It says, first of all, you have to be in a place that you are legally able to be. So you can't be trespassing on someone's property, okay? So in your own house, that's a place you're legally able to be, right? Then it says you can't be the aggressor. So even if you're in your own house, you cannot start the confrontation, start the aggressiveness, and then shoot someone and say, oh, I was standing my ground in my own house. No. So in your own house or in a place you're legally able to be, and you are not the aggressor. So you didn't start the whole thing, right? Then it says if those two situations are correct, then if someone poses a situation where there is likely to cause injury or death, you don't have a duty to retreat. So it's saying if all those things are true, and then there is a threat where a reasonable person, we talked about reasonable a little while ago, if a reasonable person would think that there is a reasonable chance of injury or death, the law basically says you do not have to retreat. You can retreat, you can run away, but the law says you don't have to. You can stand your ground and stay in this place that you have every legal right to be. So please put in the chat about what part of that law is unreasonable or that you would want to be changed. So to me, this seems pretty clearly, and there was some criticism about this wasn't a deadly force situation, like he didn't have to shoot him. And listen, if someone is breaking into your house, that's the threat. Okay, that is when deadly force is appropriate. Again, you don't have to wait till people come in. Yeah, I mean, the dad basically went into Liam Neeson mode to protect his kids, to protect his daughter. The daughter thanked the dad, you saved my life, all that kind of stuff. Now, so I watched a bunch of news stories. I watched a bunch of news stories about this case, and I found that there was a private Facebook group, something to the effect of, support for James Rael. Now, again, let me say this. If you're the family of Mr. Rael, he's a 22-year-old who was killed by his ex-girlfriend's father. Okay, so obviously there should be sympathy for the family, right? No matter what that situation is, it has to be such a tragedy for that family. Even if the 22-year-old is the one who messed up and shouldn't have been doing that, I would not expect family members to be in any reasonable state of mind to be able to look at this case in a rational way. That just isn't something that, the human brain can process. Any of us would probably think the same thing if we were in that situation. But, they said that there was this private Facebook group, so I was curious because I wanted to see what the other side of the argument was. So I requested to join the group, and I did a little undercover work, and they let me in. So because I was really curious, not because I wanted to be a troll or be rude, I honestly wanted to see, and this was the only way to do it, I honestly wanted to see what are people saying on the other side. And so here are some of the things that I learned from being a part of this private Facebook group, kind of as an observer. What they said is that, that there's more to this story than is being told. Here's one of the things that the family members and the supporters are saying, is that, yes, they were ex-girlfriend, ex-boyfriend, but there's some evidence that she actually lured him over to the house. Again, that there's no evidence in any court documents or anything. There's nothing publicly out there that I've seen to support that, but that are what some of his supporters are saying. So what they're saying is that, hey, she asked him to come over. She lured him over to the house. That's why he was there. And then they said, once he was outside the house, he could hear that there was yelling and screaming coming from inside the house. And he was actually trying to be a good guy. He thought that the dad was battering the daughter or the mom, and that he was actually trying to break in to save the day. Again, there's no evidence of that. There's nothing objective, but this is just what his supporters are saying. So, also, they're saying that, he wasn't a threat. He wasn't armed. One individual said that, they should have just let him come in the house and then fight it out like men. And that's absolutely ridiculous. That's not a thing. You don't have any, like I said, the law doesn't require you to let someone break into your house, do like some kind of a screening with them to see what their level of violence might be. That isn't a thing. You don't have to allow that to happen. Then they said that, the person didn't have to shoot 3 times. That, even if they did have to shoot, maybe they only should have shot once or twice. So, like I said, I don't see any objective, the things that there can be evidence for, like, did she actually, are there text messages or phone call logs where it says that she told him to come over? So that hasn't been produced publicly from anyone, but I was curious to see what the other side said, because I think, so it's one of these things, whenever I look at a case and I say, oh, this is obvious. This is so obvious that this is the right thing. Those are the situations where I try to train myself that, okay, that's when I should be asking harder questions. When I think something is just a little too simple, just a little too perfect, that's the exact time when you should say, no, this is when we have to ask the hard questions. That's why I went in, and this is the best evidence or the best information from the other side. So there are not charges that are going to be filed, but I just wanted to put it out there that this is some of the information from the other side, what they are saying. And so let's see, Ego 10. He had already chased the mom and the girlfriend to the house, so I don't see anything wrong. Yeah, I agree, Ego 10. I agree with you 100%. I think this is a justified shooting. I'm glad that they weren't charged. The family with the dad wasn't charged. Let's see. None of it seems logical. Bruce Blankenship. Yeah, no, I agree. I think you're saying that, what they're saying. No, it doesn't seem logical. But yeah, I mean, again, like I'm not. If it's your family member and it's your 22-year-old son or brother, like I get them not being in like a rational headspace to where they could like look at this case like it's like a law school problem. Like you can't look at these cases objectively. It's your family member. I get that. Okay. Let's see. Any other questions? 3 rounds is reasonable, unlike the 9 from the last one. Yeah, Bruce Bruce Blankenship, great point. Yeah, no, 3 rounds absolutely seems reasonable in a case like that, whereas the 9 in the case before seemed excessive. And, I think, we always talk about our legal system. It's not perfect, but let's look at this. So I think most of us agrees that that last case with the shooting with the guy in the wheelchair, 9 rounds, we all say, hey, that seems unreasonable, and the officer's being charged. Here's a case where we have, 3 rounds that were shot, someone trying to break in. We go, oh, that's probably about right, and the individual isn't charged. So here we have a couple examples of, our legal system, at least in these cases, seems to be working, which I would much rather report on cases where the legal system is working than in cases when it is not working. One of the other cases I think is really interesting is it was NYPD. So we're also going to post the video to this one as well. There's a cell phone video and a body camera video. So and this is in this past week. And so NYPD was going to arrest an individual who had a warrant for an attempted murder. Now, this person's out in public. They're not inside of a house or an apartment. They're in public, okay? So as detectives and officers are trying to arrest this individual, for attempted murder, and he ended up having a gun on him as well. So they're trying to arrest him. He's struggling with them a little bit. And again, he does have a gun on him as well. They're struggling with the officers a little bit. His girlfriend, a 19-year-old Tamani Crum, she comes up and she slaps one of the officers in the middle. So they're in public. They're trying to arrest a violent person for a violent crime who's armed with a gun. And a 19-year-old girl comes up and interferes with that and slaps one of the police officers. He's a detective. He's not having it. He basically slaps her right back, and she falls down and hits the pavement pretty hard. So people are all up in arms about this. And whether that was a reasonable use of force, we can have that debate. So so from the point of the officer, I hope we can all agree that in the moment when you're trying to arrest a violent person for a violent felony who's armed with a gun, it's safer for the officers, the person you're arresting, and the community if you get that person in handcuffs as quickly as possible. I think we can all agree, hey, this is a reasonable thing that the officers are trying to do. So lawful objective. I always talk about lawful objective. If what the police officers are trying to do isn't reasonable, I'm going to have a whole lot of problems if there's a use of force. But in this case, it's and put in the chat if you think I'm wrong. So it seems like the goal of the cops to get this guy into custody quick seems like it's reasonable because it's literally the safest thing for everyone there. Right? So then you have someone who is trying to interfere with that, pushing the officer and actually slaps one of the officers. So in a situation like that, the officer wanted to get that person away from them as soon as possible, so to not have the interfering make it so the individual does start to reach for their gun. If that's the case, maybe one of the officers gets involved in a shooting. This is worst case scenario stuff. So yeah, you want who's ever interfering with it and literally battering police officers, you want that to stop. So he hits her and she hits the ground pretty hard because he is a big, strong guy and she is a small 19-year-old girl. So it looks bad. So people are all up in arms about this. But here's what I have to say. Eric Adams, who is the mayor of New York City, he's a retired lieutenant. I believe he's a lieutenant with the New York City Police Department. He's definitely more reasonable and pro-police and pro-common sense than Bill de Blasio was, but he does sometimes, doesn't get along with the police union, but in this case, he actually came out and supported the officer pretty good. He basically said that the police officers were in a hard situation. He described that situation. He said it could have been dangerous. An individual was interfering, and he said that the level of force the officer used, that was an example of NYPD using great restraint based on what they were trying to do at the time. So he came out in public support of the officer. I think that is a good thing to do because I think that is absolutely correct thing for the mayor to do. I'm really glad he said that. Comment in there if you think that is incorrect. Now, this case is still going to be looked at by Internal Affairs, and they are going to do an investigation. And also the DA in New York, Alvin Bragg, who is not a fan of police officers, he is also going to be looking at this from the prosecutor side to see if the police officer committed any crime. So it is going to be investigated criminally by a DA who doesn't like cops, and then also by NYPD Internal Affairs. So it's still going to be investigated, but I'm glad that the mayor came out there and publicly supported the officer because I don't think the officer did anything wrong in that particular case. So if police officers are trying to arrest someone, you shouldn't interfere. So if it's an illegal arrest, fight it in court. Do not get into a fight with police officers on the street. That's not how our system works. So let's see. So the last case that I want to talk about, and this is a tragic case, and it's actually the one and only case that I've ever seen about this. And a lot of the stuff I said at the beginning about Graham versus Connor and objective reasonableness and the reasonable officer standard, I mean, it fits in exactly here, and this is exactly how it is supposed to work. So here's what happened. This was in Atlanta, and the individual's name was Jerry Blassingame. He is a 65-year-old homeless man, and he was panhandling. Police officers were called. Officers tried to contact him, and he ran. I don't know how fast he can run. He's 65 years old. He ran from police officers. As he's running from police officers through a residential neighborhood, and again, the only crime is panhandling, asking people for money on the side of the road. That's it. That was his criminal offense. As he's 65-year-old man, as he's running from police officers, an officer is running behind him, and he tases him. He tases Mr. Blassingame. Mr. Blassingame is running. He was tased. He falls, and he suffers unbelievable serious injuries. I think he's a quadriplegic right now. He did survive, but he's a quadriplegic right now. This case happened, several years ago, I think 4 or 5 years ago. There was a federal lawsuit that was filed, and a federal jury just awarded Mr. Blassingame, and we do have video of this as well. The federal jury just awarded Mr. Blassingame $100 million. This is the biggest lawsuit that I know that this has ever happened. Essentially, the jury said the jury is charging $60 million to the city and $40 million to the officer. Now, obviously, the police officer doesn't have $40 million, so he'll never collect on that part of it. The department might cover the officer as well for whatever his part is, and the department, and on behalf of the officer, has asked the judge to lower that amount. So maybe the federal judge will. But I can tell you that the federal judge, people talk about like qualified immunity and stuff like this. So this is the perfect case that I'm going to use to when qualified immunity, this is how it's supposed to work. So the judge denied qualified immunity and allowed this lawsuit to go through. That was absolutely appropriate. And the judge talked about a couple things, when it came to just even allowing this in the first place. I should say that some states have limits on lawsuit settlements, just like in the Amber Heard case. So, hey, only cops, how are you? So just because they were awarded $100 million doesn't mean that they'll actually get that, but they're probably going to get a whole bunch. Again, some states might have limits. I'm not sure what the limit in Georgia is, but my guess is that $100 million will get lowered. And again, 40% of it from the officer you'll never collect anyways, because no officer has $40 million unless... there's no officer who has $40 million. So the judge made a couple comments, basically right out of language from Graham versus Connor, in talking about why he was going to let this lawsuit proceed in the first place. He said that the seriousness of the crime, he said this wasn't a serious crime. It was panhandling. So, when talking about the reasonableness of force, seriousness of the crime is one of the 3 major factors that we have to look at. So seriousness of the crime, we have panhandling. It's not a serious crime. Why are the officers even chasing somebody for this? And then immediacy of the threat. So was the guy a threat? So when we think about, was someone a threat? If someone is running with a knife towards police officers, yeah, that's a threat. If someone is unarmed running away from police officers, so their goal is to get away from police officers, that's literally just about the opposite of being a threat to police if someone's unarmed trying to run away. So the judge made those 2 points, that it was not a serious crime and that he didn't pose a threat to the police officer. And despite that, the police officer tased the person as they're running away. So I think that was absolutely correct for the judge to deny qualified immunity in this particular case, and I think that the individual deserves a lot of money. So his attorneys, and again, attorneys have a job, they're representing something, who knows if what they say is true, but what the attorneys from Mr. Blassingame have said, they said that since this happened, he has already racked up $14 million in medical debt due to this, and also that he needs, because he's a quadriplegic now, that he needs round-the-clock care that costs about $1 million a year. So he's 65 years old. I don't know how long he's going to live, maybe 10 years, maybe 20 years. But if it's $1 million a year, so think about it this way, if every year it's $1 million a year is what it costs, that's not even anything punitive or anything. That's just like basic level care just for him to survive. So if we do get into the range of $20, $30, $40 million settlement in this particular case, like that would not shock me. again, he already has $14 million in medical debt. So a typical $5-6 million settlement that a lot of people get when there's an unlawful killing by a police officer. In my opinion, that's not going to be enough. And we've had this issue before. So I talk about tasers a lot, but I talk about. And so it looks like Georgia law does cap punitive awards at $250,000. So he'll get more than that, but at least when it comes to the punitive part, when there are civil lawsuits, you get the main part of the lawsuit, and then you can sue extra for punitive. It looks like a punitive limits in Georgia's $250. So he'll get millions of dollars from the city, and then a cap at punitive at $250,000 on top of that. But I talk about tasers a lot, and I've talked about multiple cases with this that it's a bad, and I went round and round with people about this for a couple, like 6 months ago. There was a case, can't remember the individual's name, but I did a couple videos on it, where essentially the police officer tased someone for a misdemeanor crime, as they were running away in the back. Now you have to think about it this way: if you're running away and you're being tased, you're going to lose control of all your muscles, and you're essentially going to just go through the air like a lawn dart, which you might even smack your head. Well, that happened in the one time. Only cop says the one time a taser works. Absolutely, God, you guys are so funny. Yeah, that's absolutely the case. The one time a taser works. Tasers fail 40%. We do so many cases on here where someone has a knife, the officer tries to tase him, the taser doesn't work, and then they resort to deadly force. But yeah, this is the one time a taser actually worked. Tasers never work in situations like this, but they did in this case. And I'm just as a blanket thing to say, it's my opinion that tasing someone who is running away is a bad idea. Okay, it just is, because it isn't like you're tasing someone who's sitting down or standing still. Because if you're running, that forward momentum that you are carrying with you just keeps going, and you have no control over when you stop. You could land on your head. That could cause serious injuries. In this case, it caused him to be a quadriplegic, which affects the quality of his life forever. So yeah, I think that's a bad idea. A lot of police departments, they have policies in place, and that says that's something to the effect of that you cannot tase someone who's running away unless deadly force is otherwise authorized. So that's a good thing for police departments to think about when they're coming up with use of force policy, because this is exactly the reason why you do not tase someone who is running away. Now, if someone has a knife or a gun, or they're posing an immediate threat, they say, I'm going to go kill that person over there, and they're running with a rock towards them. I get it, but that isn't the situation here, panhandling. And one last thing on panhandling. So there's been a lot of different, so I'm going to ask this question. Please put in the chat, what's the difference between someone panhandling on the side of the road and the Cub Scouts or the Boy Scouts standing on the side of the road asking for money? For people, when someone dies in the family and they're standing on the side of the road for like a car wash. Not even if someone dies in the family and they're trying to raise money for a funeral, but what about if firemen doing food drives? So we could think of a lot of different situations where people stand on the side of the road to try to collect money. Well, it's really different when it comes to the First Amendment, being able to, the freedom of expression in the First Amendment. It's difficult to say Boy Scouts, Cub Scouts, firefighters, they can stand on the side of the road and ask for money, but homeless people who are panhandling, they can't. So it's really hard to make that distinction. So there's actually a lot of places where panhandling was illegal that since these laws have been challenged, that it's found to be unconstitutional. So I think that at least my opinion on that would be, no, I don't like to see panhandlers. I would prefer that people donate money to charities and to food banks to actually, to the actual resources instead of giving it to people on the street. So I would prefer that people didn't do that. Still donate, still be charitable, still be generous, but just give it to the different food banks and the different charities and let them help people who are in need. I think that's the best way to go. So I don't want to see panhandlers on my street that I live at. Nobody does. But should it be illegal? Should the government arrest you and throw you in a cage and take away your freedom because you're standing on the side of the road saying something? So no. So even though I don't like it, I don't want it in my community, nobody does, it should not be illegal. The government should not be able, in my opinion, the government should not be able to throw you in a cage and arrest you for doing that. And when it comes to First Amendment issues, really the First Amendment, almost the only time it matters is when it's speech that you don't like. So if it's stuff that you do like, Yeah, absolutely. Everybody's for it. But it's when you don't like the speech, that's when this stuff matters. And that's when you have to start asking hard questions and being intellectually consistent with how you feel about these issues. So those were the cases that I wanted to go through this week. And I'm sure next week we're going to have all kinds of other cases that we will go over then as well. So I'm just going to see if anybody has any other comments. Only cops, he wants to taste the Boy Scouts too. Absolutely, that is funny. And if you haven't already, make sure that you follow and subscribe to Cop Watch TV so you can be here for the lives, and also so you can watch all the different Raw Police videos we put out during the week. If you want to follow me, I'm at Police Law News at TikTok and YouTube. And I hope everybody has a great and safe 3-day weekend. Thank you.